I'm Mark Ramsey. I am absolutely positively thrilled to be talking to Dave Itzkoff today. Dave Itzkoff is a New York Times writer and author of the fabulous new book called Mad as Hell, and I got to get the subtitle right, Dave. The Making of Network and the Fateful Vision of the Angriest Man in Movies. What a great subtitle. Hold up the book, Dave, for a second.
Certainly. Just in case there was any doubt, how's that?
In case I got it wrong, there it is. Yeah, we're talking about the movie network, the making of the movie network. And a lot of people are going to say, okay, yeah, I've seen that movie. That's a good movie. For me, it's one of my all-time favorite movies. My first question is, what brings you to write a book that's about that movie, considering, if I'm not mistaken, that movie was released the year you were born?
That's right. But I think that's part of the interest and the appeal to me. I've just always loved the popular culture from that era, from the mid to late 1970s. And that was a time when things in the country weren't going so great, and the culture was not afraid to reflect it. I mean, it was certainly an era of movies like Marathon Man and Carrie and All the President's Men, and to really be able to dig in and tell the story of one movie in particular, and a movie that was, of course, so fixated on media, that was about both film and television and their sort of interrelationships, and to really get to just dive into the papers of Paddy Chayefsky, who was the screenwriter of the film, and really it's the emanating force behind it, just made it so irresistible.
Now, Aaron Sorkin. In your book, you quote Aaron Sorkin saying, "No predictor of the future, not even Orwell, has ever been as right as Chayefsky was when he wrote Network." Now, a lot of the book is about the kind of the backstory and the making of and the aftermath of Network in its time, but the last portion you reserve for conversations with people like Sorkin, contemporary media figures, a lot of people that we might perceive as kind of the offspring of Howard Beale, the anchor, the famously sopping wet, crazed anchor in Network.
Right.
And I wonder what Aaron says. How is he right about that?
Well, there are a number of different things that the movie anticipates. Even sort of spells out directly that one of the central conflicts in the film that's set up is between a kind of old school, television news head, the character played by William Holden, a guy who sort of came up with people like, Fred Friendly and, that whole cohort, and an entertainment executive played by Faye Dunaway, who's constantly threatening the Holden character. Even while they're carrying on this kind of torrid love affair, she's telling him, one day I'm going to take over your news show. And that is exactly what happened to news, that it basically, lost its kind of, its patina of, basically being a public service and not having to be, networks didn't have to worry about turning a profit with their news operations. And that went away some 30-odd years ago, that news had to be profitable in the same way as a TV drama or a sitcom, and that's when news kind of stopped being news. You can also point to how the movie anticipates the rise of reality television, and certainly the rise of on-air personalities like Howard Beale, who are much more interested in telling you how to feel about the news than actually telling you what the news is.
Well, that's an understatement. But the most famous scene in the movie, obviously, is the one where Beale just calls people to go to their windows, raise their windows, and shout, "I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore."
Exactly.
That's the famous scene of the movie. It is the origin of broadcast media outrage, wouldn't you say?
I think that's fair to say, exactly. And the audience knows, the audience is kind of appreciating that scene on a couple of different levels, because, we know as viewers of the movie that at that point in the film, Howard Beale went insane several scenes ago. We're not listening to just a very passionate, riled up man. We're listening to somebody who really has gone mad. Yet in his insanity, there are these kernels of truth, and all the things that he's talking about in his mad as hell speech about inflation and financial depression and punks running wild in the street and such. I mean, those were all things that people in America in 1976 were very concerned about. Certainly, Patty Chayefsky was deeply afraid of pretty much all those things.
It's interesting to me, though, that, compared to the outrage we see expressed in media today, both on television and radio and the news, that it seems like at least Howard Beale was authentically outraged. Whereas my sense is that now that the secret's out, now that the news is abjectly a business, that everyone's winking at each other, and the only people not in on the joke are really the audience. Whereas at least Beale wasn't winking. Is that your sense?
I think that that's very fair to say. I mean, certainly, again, we know that the Beale character really has gone mad, but that the passion behind his speech is sincere. And by the end of the film, when he's performing in this live studio audience, I mean, a news show with a studio audience, and people are basically, commanded by a studio or a stage director to, let's all shout out, "I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it." I mean, that language has become, completely empty. They're just sort of saying it because somebody told them to say it. So at that point, they're completely disconnected from the Beale message.
That's true.
The movie's deeply cynical at that point.
I was watching Nancy Grace the other night, and she had a chyron beneath her that said not outrage. David said breaking outrage. If that isn't the purest manifestation of Howard Beale in 2014, breaking outrage, I just don't know what is.
Right. Please disregard all previous outrage. This is new outrage.
New and fresh outrage. And you say in the book, and where these news channels, talking about the cable news channels, have found devoted audiences, there has simultaneously arisen a new category of anchors who see it as their purpose to articulate their rage for them. And that's what you're talking about, right?
Right, and that is language that really is lifted right out of the screenplay for Network. That you have Diana Christensen and other characters talking about Howard Beale articulating the rage of his audience. That you have a viewership that really is very frustrated and tightly wound up and doesn't really have the language for the anger that they feel, and that is what Howard Beale is providing for them. And he's basically, telling them what to be angry about and how they, how to feel their anger. That's the service that he's providing.
If in fact news is to a degree entertainment, if you go beyond the parameters of news to create a broader world called infotainment, whatever you want to call it, and that's where the lowest common denominator leads you, is that necessarily bad?
Well, I mean, I think in some cases you're talking about kind of closed circles of communication where it's a person basically saying to people what they already want to hear, and then them kind of feeding it back to that broadcaster, and so it's all sort of contained within a self-sustaining unit. It's not really this is not being transmitted to anybody else. It's not reaching anybody who didn't already think that way. So I guess in that sense, it's not terrible, but it's as the number of channels and avenues for people receiving information has grown and grown. I mean, there are so few places anymore that you can really say are just sort of dispassionate presenters of news. Everything from whether it's radio or cable TV, broadcast network, and certainly the internet. I mean, everything has to have a spin now. Everything has to have opinion or a certain flavor to it. And that's just almost a necessity now in order to distinguish yourself or stand out. And that's the bigger problem.
There has to be some kind of primal spark to get people's attention, and it's always easier to make people angry than to make people love you, right?
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and just certainly that feeling that your viewpoint, no matter how narrow, nobody else is representing except for me. This other person doesn't get it quite right, isn't quite angry enough, or isn't angry at the same things in the same way that I am, and that's what you should listen to me for. And so certainly, the more and more outlets you have, and the more likely you're going to find that one-to-one connection. But again, everybody's just sort of living in these silos, that they're not really engaging with viewpoints that differ from their own in any way, or that in any way represent objective fact.
But it seems like that's a good point. That all of a sudden, fact itself becomes fungible. But it seems like it goes back to a point where news is a certain objective thing, and evolves to a point where news is now entertainment, and thus is no longer an objective thing, let alone even necessarily factual. And
well, I think it's true that we do sort of even romanticize news in the 60s and 70s as being purer, and there was a certain amount of opinion mixed in with the TV news at that time, and there were very carefully labeled news commentaries delivered by people like Eric Sevareid, and certainly Walter Cronkite was very famous for those rare moments when he would kind of step out of his role as a news presenter and offer his own opinion, or at least seem to have a take on events, and those were so few and far between. At that time, the networks were also reaching people by the tens of millions.
Right.
So the responsibilities there, I think, were greater. Now that those audiences have dwindled so much, maybe the sense is anything we can do to just maintain whatever viewership we have is acceptable.
Well, that's interesting because it clearly, when you see all the focus on health news and other things that are, would never have qualified as news back in the day,
sure.
You have to wonder that. And Keith Olbermann made a comment to you. He indicated that, it's just we're close to the point of having someone like Olbermann or someone like O'Reilly do a commentary in the end of a newscast for a major network. And I read that and I thought, I would watch that. When is that?
That is essentially what happened when, for the brief period that Katie Couric was the anchor at CBS, not just, inviting on those kinds of commentaries, but there was, so much sort of experimentation and play done with, what even constitutes a news segment anymore. And you would think that that's sort of a fairly established, formula at this point. We know what a news segment is, but they really were ready to just kind of throw that whole formula out the window.
For anyone who thinks this is just over the top and remembers that there was a character in the movie in the tabloid show called Sybil, what was Sybil the Soothsayer, right?
Right.
I was stunned in your book when I read that apparently one of the guilty pleasures of Anderson Cooper was a guy named Walter Mercado. Can you talk about who Walter Mercado? He's still around, but I guess he's not where he was anymore.
He was affiliated with Univision, and that he would actually be a part of their Spanish language broadcast. And this was somebody who actually came out and gave basically astrological readings, and that was also considered in that context a suitable part of a news broadcast, not just what happened yesterday, but what might happen to you tomorrow if you're a Capricorn or a Libra, and that not too far removed from what Sybil the Soothsayer was apparently doing on the Howard Beale show.
I watched some video of Mr. Mercado, and he is Sybil doesn't get close to this man for flamboyance. One of the last quotes you have from Sorkin: "The commoditization of the news and the devaluing of the truth are just a part of our way of life now. You wish Chayefsky would come back to life long enough to write the internet."
Yeah, I thought that was pretty terrific. Again, for a guy who lived in an era of only 3 broadcast networks, really no cable TV, certainly no internet, no World Wide Web, no social media, and you think about how applicable his critiques and satire is to an internet age, and just think about how horrified he'd probably be by something like Twitter. It would just drive him crazy.
Clearly, the internet media, anytime that it's about clicks and attention, the tendency is to go even farther in that direction, is it not?
Sure. There's far less. There's even less. Responsibility in online media in that sense, and there's also, the multiplicity of voices is, by like a factor of 100 or 1,000, and you think about, again, all those people just like shouting out their windows, creating this kind of cacophony, and that's, a lot of social media feels that way sometimes. That a news event occurs, you go on Twitter, and you just see, this proliferation of tweets of people just all kind of shouting at each other, and who's reading any of it?
That's a great question. Bots in Singapore.
Right.
So where do you see us going from here?
Oh man, I wish I had that kind of predictive power. The book is really more about a moment when a person was sort of calling our attention to how things could go and what would happen if we weren't careful. And the lesson is that we weren't careful. We didn't really heed the warnings, and we inherited the world that he predicted. So I guess in some sense, that course has already been determined for us, and the genie can't be put back in that bottle.
Breaking outrage. Thank you, David Scoff.
Exactly.
Author of Mad as Hell, The Making of Network, the movie Network, and The Fateful Vision of the Angriest Man in Movies. Dave, there's the book. Terrific book. Everybody check it out. Tells the future. Great job, Dave. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me today.
You're welcome.